Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is right now. Libraries are quiet places, filled with stories, study tables, and shelves that never seem to end. But silence can hide strange things, especially when the last patron leaves and the lights begin to dim. I had never believed the stories people told about the basement. Most of them came from new staff, interns, or part-time assistants who didn't know the building well and let their imaginations get the better of them. They'd say the air felt strange down there, or that they couldn't concentrate for more than a few minutes without getting a headache. Some claimed they heard things when they were alone. Soft shuffling, breathing, or the distant sound of something falling. I always assumed it was the usual creaks and groans of an old structure settling through the night. The Charleston Athenaeum Library had stood for over a century and a half, and the basement had seen little renovation in all that time. It was cold, stone-lined, and filled with forgotten history. That atmosphere alone was enough to unsettle people who weren't used to being around silence and decay. I had worked at the library for close to 10 years by the time anything happened that I couldn't easily explain. It was a Tuesday in early March of 2007, and I had chosen to stay late to finish processing a shipment of materials that had arrived from a nearby estate office. The documents were mostly ledgers and handwritten correspondence, and they needed to be reviewed, sorted, and prepared for an exhibit on Charleston's post-bellum economic history. I didn't mind the solitude. I preferred working at night, when the last of the staff had already left, and the only sound in the building came from the distant hum of the HVAC system and the faint rattle of tree branches against the high windows. By a little after 8, I had already locked the front doors and confirmed that the alarm had been set for the main entrance. My colleague Meredith had left earlier that evening, and no one else was scheduled to be on site. I was seated at the reference desk on the main floor, reviewing a list of archived materials, when I first heard the noise. It wasn't particularly loud, but it stood out immediately because of its rhythm and location. I could hear the sound of pages being turned, several in quick succession, coming from directly beneath me in the basement archive. The noise was clear enough that I paused what I was doing and looked up from my work. At first, I assumed one of the senior researchers must have come in late without checking in. It wasn't common, but a few had keys and special access privileges. Still, I hadn't heard the door open, and the security system had not registered any new activity. I waited a few seconds, expecting to hear footsteps or another sound, but the building had gone silent again. I rose from my chair and walked across the hall toward the basement door. I unlocked it with the key on my lanyard, opened it just enough to see down the stairwell, and called out to ask if anyone was down there. No voice responded. There were no footsteps. I waited for a reply, but was met only with a soft mechanical hum that always came from the temperature regulation unit tucked into the far end of the archive. I called out a second time, more loudly this time, with no change. The stillness in the space began to press inward, and I suddenly became very aware of how quiet the entire building was. I turned on the flashlight on my phone and began to descend. The stone steps were worn from age, and the wooden railing along the left side was polished smooth from years of use. As I reached the last step and stepped onto the basement floor, the fluorescent ceiling light, one of the few modern fixtures in that part of the building, began to flicker. It had done that before, and I had always assumed it was an issue with the wiring. But before I had taken more than 2 steps forward, the light above me shut off completely with an audible snap. I was suddenly left in almost total darkness, with only the dim glow of my phone to guide me. My flashlight beam revealed shelves of aging books and archival boxes, all lined up in long rows stretching toward the back of the room. The light caught the faint glint of metal brackets and the texture of old spines, some of which were cracked and slouched against one another from years of neglect. As I moved the light across the room, I saw something that immediately caused my breath to catch. Several books had been removed from the far shelves and lay scattered across the stone floor. Some were lying open, their pages bent awkwardly. Others had been dropped face down or stacked without care in uneven piles that did not resemble the way any staff member would leave archival material. Near the center of the room was a long wooden table, scarred and faded from decades of use. On top of it sat a single volume that had been opened and positioned as though someone had been sitting there reading it. Unlike the rest of the books, which looked as though they had been pulled down in a hurry, this one had been placed deliberately. Its binding was thicker than the others, and the leather cover had worn thin along the corners and spine. I slowly approached the table and raised the beam of my phone to get a better look at the open page. It appeared to be a ledger, likely handwritten in the mid-1800s, filled with lists of names and numbers recorded in tight, slanted cursive. The ink was faded, but still legible, and the parchment had yellowed in the way old paper does after more than a century in storage. But what drew my attention wasn't the document's content. In the margin beside the main text, someone had written something in pencil, something that did not belong there. It was my full name. Not just my first or last, but every part of it. First, middle, and surname, written clearly and deliberately in graphite. The handwriting was recent and untouched by time, pressed so firmly into the paper that I could see the indentations made by the pencil tip. The name appeared twice. Once in the upper corner, where it had been written with uneven pressure, and once again lower on the page, where it looked more careful and deliberate, as though someone had been trying to perfect their strokes. I felt a coldness rise through me that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. I had never seen this ledger before. I hadn't handled it during any of my earlier inventory sessions. And it wasn't part of the materials I'd been working on that week. It didn't match the volumes I'd pulled from the shipment upstairs. And there was no reason, absolutely none, for my name to be written inside it. I backed away from the table, still holding the light on the page, unwilling to turn my back completely, but increasingly certain that I needed to leave the basement immediately. Without checking the rest of the room, I turned and retraced my steps across the stone floor, up the narrow staircase, and into the main lobby. My breath felt uneven, and I realized I had been holding my jaw tight without knowing it. I relocked the basement door, slid the padlock into place, and stood still for a moment beside the front desk, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. I remained there for some time before finally gathering my belongings and leaving the building. The next morning, I arrived early and requested access to the building's overnight surveillance logs. I needed to know if someone had entered the library after hours, even though I had seen no signs of forced entry. The cameras showed nothing unusual. Meredith was recorded leaving just before 8, and I could be seen locking the front doors and setting the alarm at 6:15. After that, there was no activity at the entrances. No motion, no movement in the lobby, and no indication that anyone had come in from the side or rear entrances. When the facility supervisor reviewed the building's internal motion sensors, he found that 6 activations had occurred in the basement between 8:30 p.m. and midnight. Each sensor registered brief, isolated movement, as though someone had been walking back and forth or pacing the room. Yet, there was no record of the basement door being unlocked during that period. The padlock had remained secured. The lights on the main floor had stayed on, and the electrical systems had not recorded any blown fuses or circuit failures that would explain the blackout in the basement. Later that week, I returned to the basement with another staff member and attempted to locate the ledger. We went shelf by shelf, box by box, scanning every spine and title. But the book was gone. It wasn't simply misplaced. It was entirely missing. I cross-checked every inventory list, every accession record, and every catalog number. And there was no documentation that matched the volume I had seen. There was no record of it being logged into the collection, no prior mention of it in our system, and no photographic record in the archival database. I never found that book again. I never saw that handwriting or my name in any other volume or document. But from that night onward, I never worked in the building alone after dark. I never entered the basement without another person present. And even now, after all these years, I can still see the image of that open page. The yellowed paper, the delicate ink, and those pencil markings etched into the margin with deliberate, steady pressure. Whoever or whatever had been down there with me, they had known my name, and they had written it by hand into a book that should not have existed. Back in the fall of 1997, during my second year at a small university in Asheville, North Carolina, I found myself falling behind on a paper from my American social history class. Between a full course load and a part-time job at a used bookstore downtown, I hadn't left myself much time. It was already late in the evening on a Thursday when I finally admitted that I needed a quiet place to concentrate and access to better archival sources than what I'd been able to scrape together on campus. I remembered that the old county library on the outskirts of town sometimes carried local historical records that the university didn't keep. So despite the hour, I grabbed my jacket, packed my notes into a canvas bag, and drove across town toward the old building that sat just beyond the main roads, partly obscured by tall trees and winding gravel paths. The library itself was tucked away in what had once been a private estate. Built in the early 1900s by a wealthy textile family, the building had been donated to the county sometime after the Second World War and converted into a public library. The structure still carried the heaviness of its past. Brick darkened by decades of weather, high narrow windows framed in thick wood, and chimneys that towered above a sagging porch lined with cracked stone tiles. When I pulled into the lot, there were no other cars in sight. The trees surrounding the property rustled quietly in the wind, and I could hear the scrape of bare branches moving against each other as I locked my car and headed toward the front entrance. Inside, the library was dimly lit, with most of the overhead lights shut off, and only a few of the brass reading lamps casting small yellow pools of light across the front desks. The building smelled faintly of old wood, drying paper, and the kind of polish used on antique furniture. The only other person I saw was the night librarian, a thin older woman seated behind the front counter with a worn hardback open in front of her. She looked up briefly when I entered, nodded once, then returned to her reading without a word. I made my way down the long corridor to the back of the building where the reading room was located. That space had always felt different from the rest of the library. The architecture in that section of the building remained largely untouched from its original design. Wooden wall panels, a coffered ceiling with carved beams, and tall windows that ran nearly from floor to ceiling. During the day, sunlight filtered in through those windows and lit the entire room in a warm, filtered glow. At night, the glass reflected the light from the floor lamps and turned the windows into long, dark mirrors that showed only the inside of the room and the faintest outlines of the trees outside. The room was quiet and cold, much colder than the rest of the building. I had been there before and remembered that the heating didn't quite reach the back end of the estate. The only sound came from the occasional click of the radiators elsewhere in the building and the soft creak of old floorboards settling overhead. I chose a seat at one of the corner tables, pulled out my books and notes, and started working through my draft. For the first hour or so, I remained completely absorbed in my research. I didn't check the time. I didn't hear any other doors open or close. There were no footsteps, no conversations, no interruptions at all. At some point, while rereading a passage about Prohibition-era civil ordinances, I paused to rest my eyes and looked across the room. There was someone sitting at a table near the far window. I hadn't heard anyone enter the room, and the floor in that part of the library was notorious for creaking with even the softest steps. Yet, there she was. A girl, seated completely upright, with her hands poised over a pad of paper. She appeared to be in her mid-teens, no older than 17, and she was wearing a long, pale dress with narrow sleeves and a high collar. Her posture was rigid, and her shoulders barely moved as she wrote. Her skin looked almost colorless under the lamp near her table, and her long, dark hair hung loose and straight, parted in the middle and falling just past her shoulders. What stood out the most, even more than her clothing, which looked like it belonged to another century, was the fact that she was barefoot. Her feet were pressed close together beneath the table, with the soles angled slightly in toward the rug. It looked like she was trying to keep them from touching the cold floor. Her hand moved slowly across the page in steady strokes, and though I couldn't hear the sound of the pencil moving, I could see the motion clearly. I watched her in silence for several seconds, trying to make sense of her presence. I had been alone for nearly an hour, and the room had remained completely quiet. I should have noticed someone entering. I should have heard the movement of her chair or the shift of footsteps behind me, but I hadn't. At first, I thought she might be a theater student or someone working on an art project, maybe part of a photography class or an experimental performance. Her clothing, while unusual, could have been part of a costume. Still, something about her presence felt out of place, not just eccentric, but detached in a way that unsettled me. She seemed too quiet, too still, and entirely unaffected by the cold or the silence. I turned my eyes back to my notebook and forced myself to keep working. I remember writing half a paragraph before glancing back at her table. She was no longer there. The chair was empty, and the girl was gone. I hadn't heard her get up. I hadn't seen a shadow move or noticed any change in the room's sound or light. One moment she was there, and the next she wasn't. The only thing left on the table was the pad of paper and a pencil lying neatly across the top. I stood up and crossed the room slowly. There was no one hiding nearby, no sign that anyone had passed through. The windows were closed, the doors remained shut, and the only item left behind was the notepad. When I picked it up, I could feel how cold the paper was. I flipped the cover open and saw that the first page was filled with handwriting. dark, frantic lines of the same sentence repeated again and again. Don't stay after midnight. The handwriting filled the page, each line pressed deeply into the paper as though written with increasing urgency. I turned the page and saw the same thing repeated. Every single sheet was covered with that same warning, scrawled over and over in increasingly shaky, slanted handwriting. The further I flipped, the more erratic the words became, the letters warping and breaking under the pressure of the pencil strokes. I carried the pad with me back toward the front desk. The librarian looked up as I approached, and without saying anything, I set the pad down in front of her. She'd opened it and began to flip through the pages. Her expression changed gradually. The look of casual interest drained from her face, replaced by something far more serious, something that looked like recognition and dread combined. She turned a few more pages without speaking. Her hand had stopped moving, and her eyes remained locked on the paper. After a long pause, she told me that the reading room had once been part of the original estate, back when the building was still a private residence. In the early 1920s, one of the daughters of the Hadley family had gone missing inside the house. The story had faded into local legend, but according to the old records, the girl had last been seen sitting in that very room, writing in her diary by the window on a late autumn night. She had never been found. No evidence had ever turned up. The police had suspected a runaway or possibly a kidnapping, but no one had ever been charged. The case had quietly disappeared over time, and most people who use the library now had no idea that part of the building had ever been tied to something so tragic. I left the library shortly after that. I didn't stop to collect the rest of my materials. I walked straight back to my car, started the engine, and drove home without turning on the radio. The roads felt darker than usual that night, and the silence inside my car didn't bring the calm I'd expected. My hands felt cold on the steering wheel, and my mind kept returning to the girl's face. Not her expression, because I hadn't seen it clearly, but the unnatural stillness of her posture and the way her hand moved without pause across the page. The next morning, I returned just after the library opened. I went straight to the reading room, hoping to see the notepad again, needing some kind of proof that it had really been there. The table was empty. I checked the front desk and asked if anything had been turned in, but the staff told me nothing had been found or left behind. I asked if the night librarian was working again, but no one seemed to know who I was referring to. They told me a different staff member had been on duty the previous night. I described the woman I'd seen. The response was confusion. There was no notepad, no record of anything being left behind. No trace of the girl, or her warning, or the pages she had filled so frantically. I never used the reading room again after that. Even when I returned to that library for future research, I chose other areas to work in. I never again stayed late, and I made sure to leave well before the last hour. Whatever I saw that night, or whoever she had once been, didn't feel like a story or a rumor or a trick of the light. It felt like a warning that had come too late for someone else, and just barely in time for me. In the fall of 2013, I was in my third year at California State University in Fresno. I was majoring in sociology and working part-time at a coffee shop near campus to cover rent and groceries. Between long shifts and a growing workload, I often found myself retreating to the university library, especially at night. My apartment, which I shared with 2 other students, was loud, drafty, and unreliable when it came to internet access. The library, by contrast, felt like neutral ground. Quiet, dependable, and detached from the rest of my daily stress. Most nights I studied on the 4th floor, where the sociology and psychology sections were housed. It was quieter than the lower levels, which meant fewer distractions. The lighting was harsh and sterile, and the floor always smelled faintly of dust and old glue. But that suited me. I usually took the same seat near the rear stairwell, next to a tall bookshelf that wrapped around one side of the study area, creating a kind of makeshift alcove. The space was enclosed enough to feel private, but not so hidden that I felt completely alone. Or at least, that had been my thinking at the time. It was just before midnight when something unusual happened. The building had shifted into its extended hours for finals week, which meant only a few students remained scattered across the upper levels. I was alone in my usual spot, working on a term paper for a class focused on deviant behavior in urban environments. After hours of reading case studies and highlighting the same paragraphs again and again, my concentration began to fade. I removed my earbuds to give myself a short break, and it was in that sudden quiet that I noticed a faint sense of being observed. There was nothing overt, no footsteps or movement, but something in the air had changed. I glanced around without standing up, assuming I'd see another student walking by or someone shelving books. Instead, I noticed a narrow space between the volumes on the shelf directly across from me. The gap wasn't wide, just enough to catch a sliver of light or a flicker of motion. But behind it, I saw something that made me sit up straighter. It was a face. A man was standing behind the shelf, perfectly still. His skin appeared unnaturally pale beneath the buzzing fluorescent lights. His features were sharp and drawn, as if he hadn't eaten well or slept in some time. His eyes were wide and fixed in my direction, though I couldn't tell if he was truly focused on me or just staring blankly through the opening. He wore a green zip-up jacket that looked faded and worn at the sleeves. He didn't shift or lower his gaze. He simply remained where he was, motionless, with a kind of cold attention that made my stomach tighten. I felt rooted in place for several seconds, unsure if I was truly seeing what I thought I was. My body finally caught up with my instincts, and I stood up quickly, collecting my belongings with clumsy urgency. When I glanced back toward the gap in the shelf, the man was no longer there. There had been no sound, no rustling, no departing footsteps, nothing to suggest movement in either direction. The aisle was empty. I left the floor immediately and reported the incident to the staff member at the front desk. He appeared tired, maybe another student like me working a late shift. He listened as I explained what I had seen and eventually called campus security. They arrived within a few minutes and did a walkthrough of the building. Unsurprisingly, they didn't find anyone matching the description I gave them. They told me it was most likely a homeless man who had managed to slip inside unnoticed, probably just trying to stay warm. The explanation sounded plausible, especially given the time of year, and I didn't argue. Even so, the encounter unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. There had been something too deliberate about the way the man stood there, hidden but not fully concealed, almost as if he had chosen that precise position to be seen, if only briefly. I avoided the 4th floor after that. For several days, I kept to the 2nd level, where the main reading area was brighter and more populated. I told myself it had been an isolated incident, maybe even a trick of the light or the result of too much stress. But then I began hearing fragments of similar stories. A girl in my criminology elective mentioned seeing a man crouched near the back corner of the microfilm room late one evening. She said he had been so still, she thought he was a mannequin until she realized he was watching her. Another student, someone I recognized from the psychology building, said he caught a glimpse of a man ducking behind one of the structural columns on the 3rd floor. In both accounts, the descriptions were consistent. A pale man in a green jacket, thin build, unusually silent, always keeping his distance, yet never fully concealed. No one had approached him directly. Each time someone tried to get close, he vanished without a trace. Some of the students assumed it was a campus prank or an urban legend starting to take shape. Others began avoiding the library's upper floors entirely. After about 2 weeks of scattered reports, campus police organized a more thorough investigation. Maintenance staff accompanied them, opening up service panels, checking access points, and inspecting crawl spaces most students didn't even know existed. The search led them to a hidden space behind one of the storage walls on the 3rd floor. A space not listed on any of the building's current schematics. It appeared to be a leftover service corridor from a renovation that had taken place decades earlier. The entrance was concealed behind a movable partition and further obscured by outdated shelving units. The corridor was extremely narrow, no more than 2 feet wide, and extended approximately 20 feet behind the wall. Inside, they found signs that someone had been living there. The floor was littered with crumpled newspaper, plastic water bottles, and the wrappers of cheap snack food. A dirty sleeping bag had been laid out against the far wall, partially unzipped and then covered in dust. There was a small pile of tattered clothing stuffed into a torn backpack. But what disturbed everyone the most was the crate beside the sleeping bag. Inside it were dozens of printed photographs. They had all been produced using a basic color printer and were arranged in neat, rubber-banded stacks. Every image depicted students inside the library, most of them alone. Some were shown sitting at desks, some browsing books, others staring at laptop screens or leaning back with closed eyes. Many of the photos had clearly been taken through narrow openings in the shelves, the angles slightly off-kilter, as if the camera had been held at chest level or even lower. Several of the photographs were of me. I recognized the green sweater I often wore on late study nights. I recognized the row of sociology books that lined the shelves near my preferred table. One photo had captured me mid-yawn. Another showed me with my back to the camera, hunched over my laptop with my earbuds in. I had never known I was being watched. Some of the photos had been marked with red ink. Circles had been drawn around students' faces. A few had handwritten notes in the margins, initials, times of day, or strange symbols I couldn't make sense of. A handful of photos had large black X's drawn across them. The university never identified who had taken the photos or how long the man had been using the space. No personal identification was found in the hidden corridor. No fingerprint matches came back. By the time they conducted the full search, the man was already gone. The area was sealed off quietly, and campus administration issued a vague statement referencing a breach of restricted maintenance access and an unhoused individual being removed from the premises. There was no public mention of the photographs, no follow-up announcements, just a quiet reassurance that security would be increased and patrols would be more frequent during evening hours. Despite that, the stories didn't stop. Some students insisted the man was still inside the building, using new hiding places or slipping in during the day. A few said they had caught glimpses of him weeks later, always from behind shelves, always disappearing the moment anyone looked too closely. I never saw him again. But after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even when I studied in public places, I found myself glancing at reflections in windows and checking the spaces between shelves without thinking. I started avoiding quiet corners and stopped using headphones whenever I was alone. It took me a long time to stop scanning my surroundings out of habit. Even now, years later, I still find myself instinctively checking for gaps in the shelves whenever I walk into a library. Not because I expect to see him again, but because I know now that someone had been there. Someone had been watching, and I never realized it until it was too late. I was present the day the wall behind the children's reading area was opened at the Deansgate Public Library in Manchester. It happened in October of 1995, during the early stages of a preservation and modernization project. At the time, I was working as a junior surveyor, assigned to assist with the historical oversight of the renovations. Most of our focus was on preserving the architectural integrity of the building while updating the outdated electrical and heating systems. No one on site expected to uncover anything beyond old wiring, rusted ductwork, and crumbling plaster. The discovery occurred on a Thursday afternoon. One of the contractors had been working near the back wall of the children's section, behind a deteriorating mural that depicted cartoonish forest animals sitting with books under stylized trees. He struck an odd seam in the wall, a shallow recess where the brickwork didn't match the rest. After a few more careful hits with his hammer and chisel, the surface cracked and began to fall away, revealing a small, narrow cavity hidden behind the wall. When I crouched down and aimed my flashlight into the opening, I immediately sensed that this space had not been disturbed for a very long time. The air inside was dry and strangely cold. Dust floated in slow, spiraling clouds, undisturbed by even the faintest current. The space itself was barely 4 feet high and just a few feet deep, no more than the size of a shallow crawl space. Sitting in the center of that enclosed area, facing a blank brick wall, was a small wooden chair built to fit a child. It had no cushion, no decoration, only smooth, time-darkened wood and subtle notches along its legs. To the right of it lay a balled-up blanket, stiff and gray with age. Around the edges of the crawl space were several toys. They were hand-carved wooden blocks with faded letters, a cloth doll missing its head, and a tin spinning top corroded with rust. These items looked like they had belonged to a child several generations ago. Their surfaces were coated with dust, and their placement appeared undisturbed. Nothing in the space showed any signs of recent movement or human activity. As I stepped inside to examine the chair more closely, I lifted it to inspect the underside. 2 lines had been carved into the wood beneath the seat. The top line consisted of a single name, Elliot, carved in shaky block letters as if by a young child pressing a dull blade or nail into the wood. Beneath it, another phrase had been etched in deeper strokes. Still here. The grooves were uneven, but the effort behind them was unmistakable. Someone had pressed into the wood with persistence, carving the message with force. The moment I read those words, a profound discomfort settled in my chest. It was not fear exactly, but something colder and deeper. A sense that this space had been waiting, unnoticed, for much longer than any of us had been alive. The wall concealing it had been fully sealed, covered in plaster and painted over at least once since the 1960s. There was no entrance from any other part of the building, and no logical reason for anyone or anything to have been inside. The authorities were called to the scene within the hour. A forensic team arrived shortly after and sealed off the area. Every object within the crawl space was photographed, catalogued, and removed with care. Their preliminary findings indicated that the space had likely been sealed for more than 30 years. There were no fingerprints, no footprints, no skin cells or fibers. The dust patterns were undisturbed, and the rust on the toys suggested long-term exposure to moisture and time. Despite the ominous message on the chair, no human remains were found. There were no bones, no clothing fragments, no evidence that a child, or anyone, had ever died inside that space. Several days after the initial discovery, an elderly woman contacted the police. Her name was Agnes Whitwell, and she had worked as a librarian at Deansgate from the late 1960s until her retirement in 1989. She had heard about the crawl space through a former colleague and reached out to offer information. I was present during her interview with the city archives team. Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke, but her voice was steady. She remembered a missing child case from April of 1978. The name she gave was Elliot Harper. According to Agnes, Elliot had visited the library with his mother on a weekday afternoon. He was 6 years old. His mother had been browsing fiction on the first floor while Elliot remained in the children's area, which at the time was considered safe enough for young children to explore independently. The room had been quiet. There were only a handful of patrons, and none of the staff remembered anything unusual. Agnes said she had seen the boy earlier in the day, seated with a picture book. But when his mother returned, he was gone. The staff searched the entire building from top to bottom. They checked the restrooms, the staircases, the supply closets, even the locked storage areas. The exits had been monitored closely, and no one had seen a child leave the building. The police were called and conducted a full search. They went over every room, including the basement and attic. No one ever found so much as a scrap of clothing or a strand of hair. The only comment that stood out came from an older man who had been reading in the children's section. He mentioned seeing a flash of red, like a coat or sweater, vanish behind the wall with the mural. But no one had taken the statement seriously. That section of the wall had already been sealed shut by then. The investigation continued for several months before going cold. Flyers with Elliot's face were posted around the city, but no reliable tips ever came in. Eventually, the story faded from public memory and joined the long list of unresolved disappearances. The library staff tried to move on. A few of them left over the following years. Agnes stayed, but she said the memory of that day never left her. When she heard that a chair had been discovered behind the wall, with the name Elliot carved into it, she broke down in tears. The crawl space had been located only 10 feet from the last place Elliot had been seen. The objects inside appeared to date back to the 1970s. The forensic analysts believe that none of the items had been moved or touched since they were placed there. And yet, that particular wall had been sealed sometime in the early 1960s, nearly 15 years before Elliot disappeared. The records were clear. The ductwork plans from that renovation showed the cavity had been closed off entirely. There was no way in and no way out. The deeper the investigation went, the more questions emerged. How had the chair, the toys, and the blanket ended up inside that space after it was sealed? Who had carved the message? And why did the phrase "still here" feel less like a declaration and more like a warning? Eventually, the crawl space was resealed, this time with reinforced concrete and heavy steel bolts. The chair and other objects were taken into police evidence and never returned to the library. Staff avoided speaking about the incident, though several employees began requesting transfers shortly afterward. One janitor quit without giving notice. Another refused to clean the children's area at night. Several of them had begun hearing faint sounds from behind the walls. Knocking, they said, or soft movements that didn't match the sound of the old pipes. One man claimed he heard humming late in the evening, a child's voice. He told no one directly, but the story spread quietly among the night staff. Years later, long after the incident had been forgotten by the public, an old photograph surfaced during a local archival project. It showed the children's section of the library in the 1970s, likely taken during a literacy event. The image captured shelves lined with hardcover books and a few children seated on the carpet. In the lower right-hand corner, near the wall with the mural, a small boy sat on the floor in a red jacket. His face was turned slightly, as though looking away from the camera. Behind him, partially obscured by shadow, was the outline of a wooden chair positioned near the wall. Its back was to the viewer. It appeared to be facing the brick. No one could confirm whether the boy in the photo was Elliot. The image was too blurry, but the timing and the location matched. And that single chair, half hidden in the background, looked exactly like the one I had pulled out of the crawl space. Even now, years later, I think about that space more often than I admit. The image of that small chair positioned in front of a blank wall with no purpose, and the words carved underneath it, still weigh on me. Still here. It wasn't just a cryptic phrase. It felt like something meant to be found, as if whoever had written it was marking their presence, not for help, but for permanence. Not because they had been forgotten, but because they had never truly left.